Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host, Milos Maggiore, and I'll be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftesnes and Jared Jeter about some of the key developments this week related to the geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor that we publish every Friday alongside this podcast. And today we're going to be starting off as usual with a brief roundup of all of the major developments happening in each of our hotspots, which as a reminder are the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, before turning to take a quick look at some of the developments out of the United States, Somalia and Venezuela. Well, they're going to take a deep dive into some of the developments coming out of the Middle East, as well as some news from the Korean Peninsula, so stay tuned for that. But first, let's jump into our roundup. Andrew, why don't you take us off?
All right, a lot to get into this week. U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to bomb Oman in rather crass terms recently over its bilateral negotiations with Iran. There's a lot of talk right now that the Iranians and the Omanis are actually close to achieving a deal. Trump said that there are no negotiations currently taking place between Iran and the United States and declared, quote, economic D-Day, essentially against any nation that is conducting trade with Iran in any way. Looking outside of the U.S.-Iran war, Israel conducted bombings in several locations, most notably in Syria at a Syrian airbase near Aleppo on August 18th. The reported reason for that attack was to destroy infrastructure there and prevent the suspected deployment of Turkish forces into that location. Quite a bit we could get into on that update. But just to keep it moving, Israel also killed 11 Lebanese in an airstrike targeting a Hezbollah commander in southern Lebanon on August 15th. That, of course, threatens a very fragile notional ceasefire that is in place right now that has been mediated by the United States. Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, met with the Hamas chief in Cairo on August 16th directly, very notably. Shortly thereafter, Kushner met with Netanyahu in Jerusalem on August 17th, basically trying to get the Israelis to come on board with Trump's 15-point peace plan for Gaza, which Hamas has previously agreed to. Netanyahu recently rejected that plan, the main issue there being the question of the disarmament of Hamas. And then the next day after that meeting between Trump and Kushner, the Israelis continued their bombardment of Gaza, killing at least 6 Palestinians on August 18th. Looking now at Europe, transatlantic relations in the Russia-Ukraine war trended toward the military escalation scenario this week. We saw Ukraine fire over 600 drones at Moscow in a single overnight attack between August 18th and August 19th. Now, I have not seen any reports of casualties from that attack, but the capability of Ukraine to conduct it, I think, really is the notable update here. That is one of the single largest attacks against Moscow of the entire war so far. British Prime Minister Andy Burnham recently reaffirmed that the UK would stand behind Ukraine, quote, 100%. This comes after direct threats from Russia against the United Kingdom for supplying drones, which we have seen Ukraine is using to great effect inside Russian territory. Russia continues the bombardment of cities across Ukraine, a particularly intense week for bombardment against civilians. Recently, at least 10 people were killed in Kharkiv on August 18th, and at least 15 people were killed in Kyiv today, August 20th, and those numbers are likely to continue to climb. Looking outside of the European continent now, Russia is reportedly bolstering Iran's wartime effort by shipping drone parts and various munitions through the Caspian Sea. And this is according to reporting out there, citing an unnamed European government official. We'll provide you updates later in the coming weeks. We'll keep an eye on that story. And then finally, Ukraine's former defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, a significant potential challenger to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in case of an election, has called for Ukraine to hold presidential elections.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So this week in Asia, we saw it trend toward diplomatic de-escalation as the joint military Olchi Freedom Shield military drills between the U.S. and South Korea were reduced by 6 days. Trump stated that these exercises held a hostile signal toward North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and he was hoping to be able to establish a good relationship with them and kind of de-escalate tensions on the Korean peninsula. North Korea had previously stated that the continuation of these joint military drills was impeding their ability to engage in bilateral talks with the U.S. and with South Korea. Also, during as sort of a response to these type of U.S. troop drawdowns, as many resources are pulled from Asia and redeployed toward the Middle East, including the last American aircraft carrier in the Pacific. Sort of as a result of this, South Korea announced on the 81st anniversary of its liberation of Japan that Japanese and South Korean President Lee Jae-myung have called for deeper bilateral ties and to be able to establish a more solid strategic military alliance. As sort of a counter to the Americans becoming less involved militarily within the Pacific. Of course, there's a very strong security relationship that is being maintained, but overall, these powers are now starting to see that they have to be able to develop a stronger multinational pan-Pacific alliance to be able to counter Chinese aggression as America becomes less available and less able to project power within the Pacific. Within the South China Sea itself, China has just begun the construction of what is suspected to be a new military base atop the Antelope Reef in the South China Sea's Paracel archipelago. This is actually very close to other constructed islands that they have built within the Spratly Islands, and this represents the continued escalation of Chinese military occupation of disputed territories within the South China Sea. Moving over to Taiwan, a source within the Chinese Communist Party has stated that China has been pressuring Taiwanese politicians to block the new Taiwanese government's proposal for increased funding for their drone aspects, as well as many other unmanned vehicles within the military. This kind of represents a growing trend that we have been seeing, where China is trying to infiltrate more aspects of the Taiwanese political system, as well as its economic infrastructure. China has pretty well known for having a long-standing reputation of trying to build economic espionage within Taiwan and the United States. However, we're starting to see a greater degree of political infiltration within the last few years from the Chinese Communist Party inside of Taiwan itself.
Thank you both. And now let's turn quickly to some of the key hotspots that we've been tracking around the world. So starting with the United States, President Trump announced that the United States and the Canadian governments came to a trade deal just hours before the deadline for a potential new 50% tariff package on Canadian goods was set to begin. The announcement itself specifies a 3-day deadline extension, and the Canadian side has confirmed that discussions were delicate and intense, to quote them, and that a lot of work remains to be done. But the signs from the Trump administration seem to be positive, though they have not specified many details on the deal itself. Still remaining with the United States, but turning to its relations with Venezuela, we've seen some degree of stabilization there as several independent US oil producers were expected to sign production contracts with Venezuelan state oil company Petróleos de Venezuela, according to industry representatives familiar with the plans. The agreements would bring additional US producers into Venezuela's oil sector as the Trump administration seeks to increase the country's production. And finally, we're keeping track on a potential security destabilizing event in Somalia this week, where Ethiopian troops operating under an African Union peace mission in Somalia have transferred control of their operating base in Burhakaba to the Somali forces stationed there, and they are set to move out of the country as the AU, the African Union, faces financial and logistical challenges. The base itself lies on a major transport line between Mogadishu and Baidoa, and experts have raised concerns with the withdrawal, stating that Al-Shabaab, a terrorist and insurgent group in the region, controls neighboring regions and could use the move as an expansion opportunity. So we're keeping an eye on all of the above. Tune in the following weeks as we bring you developments on them. So that concludes our roundup. Now let's bring it back to our discussion. So Andrew, Jared, We wanted to talk briefly about some of the developments that you mentioned up top, Andrew, regarding the Middle East. So, on the one hand, you've got Oman being dragged into the conflict, at least rhetorically, by President Trump. What is the situation with that? And do you have a sense that with that, we're going to see any kind of development with regards to Iran, or is it just going to remain, business as usual for the foreseeable future?
Well, the real question is, it depends on what we mean by business as usual, right? So basically, what's going on is that the Iranians and the Omanis have been conducting their own bilateral negotiations for the last few weeks, specifically regarding passage of international trade through the Strait of Hormuz. And a lot of reporting right now indicates that they're very close to making a deal. And if there's public reporting indicating that, then we can assume that U.S. government officials are operating off additional information, right? But it's safe to assume that we're very close to seeing that happening. Where that update comes from is that, but Trump threatened to bomb Oman if they went forward with trying to establish a deal with the Iranians without the United States. Of course, the U.S. would have the ability to disrupt any deal that it didn't like, right? Now, there could be, of course, like severe security and diplomatic and obviously economic ramifications from that. But that's the gist of that.
And you also mentioned that President Trump issued threats, at least of economic retaliation, to basically any country that deals with Iran. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Trump threatened economic D-Day, the president's words, not mine, against any country that engages in any sort of trade with Iran. Now, will he follow through with that in any way? Who knows, right? Honestly, who knows? Ask the Canadians. There's a lot of back and forth, obviously, on Trump's economic policy. Jared, you want to jump in?
Yeah, one thing that, assuming that there is any type of follow through to the threats made, one thing that this could really have major implications on is the United States already does not have a huge economic relationship with many of the countries that do trade with Iran. But one very noticeable example and very important example is China. China does quite a lot of trading with Iran, particularly in terms of energy. Now, if America were to begin launching large-scale sanction packages or tariffs against China as a result of their continued cooperation with Iran, that might have some very significant economic downstream effects.
Yeah, no, good point, Jared. I appreciate that. One thing I'll add, separate but related to this whole conversation, is that I think the most important thing that is not getting enough attention right now, at least in American media, is everything in the Middle East outside of Iran, right? Things in the notional so-called ceasefire in Lebanon, of course, was shaky from the get-go. Within the last 2 weeks, and especially this week, that's been there's been intense escalation from the Israeli side. I think that the Israeli bombing of the Syrian airbase in Aleppo is probably like the most underserved story out of the Middle East this week, right? Things in, again, another notional so-called ceasefire in Gaza are going, the implementation of Trump's 15-point plan and the Board of Peace in general is simply a disaster as far as like practical implementation goes, and tangible effects from these diplomatic efforts on the ground. And all of those problems would continue if the Iran war fully ended tomorrow.
No, and it's good that you bring Lebanon into this because, I mean, it feels like, I mean, it was weeks ago that we talked about the signing of the peace, or rather a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. And there was a lot of worries that, something could come in and spoil that or derail that. And now we're seeing, I mean, I think this is the second week in a row that there's been an exchange of fire between Hezbollah and Israel. And, that would, in my view, qualify as derailing the ceasefire agreement. But, so how do you make light of that?
No, good point. And I should clarify. I could be mistaken, so I will double check. But I don't think that Hezbollah has retaliated directly against Israeli forces from this last strike, which was targeting a high-level Hezbollah commander and killed a number of civilians in that same attack. Again, I could be mistaken. These kinds of things develop quickly, but the last I saw, there was not direct retaliation from Hezbollah. Right now, clearly for reasons of their own, but the whole, again, I think we have to continuously use this disclaimer. Notional ceasefire is, the Israelis have said that the pilot program, right, which references like the exchange of territory that they're supposed to be conducting with the Lebanese army, is essentially done, and that they will not leave their occupation of southern Lebanon until Hezbollah is disarmed, right? Copy and paste that in Gaza and replace Hezbollah with Hamas, really, right? It's the same thing. And there's, I don't know if we have the time for that today, but there's we could talk about the reasons why Netanyahu is pursuing that kind of path, as well as the escalation with Turkey via Syria. Jared?
Yeah, Andrew, I wanted to get your take on something here. You were just kind of mentioning the type of things Netanyahu is actually like kind of aiming for here. Now, with the American administration, of course, the Trump administration is very outwardly very supportive of Israel. They've continued to provide military funding at a consistent pace. However, Trump is not exactly secretive about his desire for the conflict within the Middle East to stop in relation to Israel. He's made several statements over the last few years being very critical of Netanyahu. What, in your opinion, is kind of the main discordance between them? What is the kind of the end game of the Trump administration here? What is the end game of the Netanyahu administration? And like, is that divergence causing any type of material breakdown in the relationship at all? Has there been any kind of reduction, or has it just kind of been mostly rhetoric with the material being status quo?
I would say it has definitely not just been rhetoric, right? I'll answer your questions backwards. The objective of Netanyahu, I believe, is to physically expand the territory of Israel, right? Specifically into Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, and of course Gaza, and that territory that Israeli soldiers are not occupying. Israel wants weak neighbors, right? It's strong enough to defend its own borders perpetually, and it perceives domestic turmoil within its neighbors as being to its advantage. What does the Trump administration want in the Middle East with its relationship with Israel, with its war in Iran? I don't know. I don't think that there is any long-term, coherent, strategic thought being put into these decisions from the administration. If there's a policy process in place to prove that claim otherwise, I'm not aware of it. But to my knowledge, I don't think there's. What is the administration trying to achieve in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, we'll be getting to that in a second, but I think what you're just saying there, Andrew, like I think this is something that Iran knows and that they are willing and able to exploit, and we're getting more and more, news about troop morale, U.S. troop morale in the region. There's all these infamous stories of sailors aboard the aircraft carrier stationed there that are simply in some cases even trying to escape, right? And that is something that Iran, if it's getting the news, and I'm sure they are aware of this, and they know that a victory for them in a sense could just be getting the US to demoralize the US enough that in the end it just leaves with no gains on the table, right? And Iran can just wait that out. Now obviously Iran has a lot of internal constraints as well that it has to bear in mind, and exterior ones too. But definitely something I'm sure that the Iranians are looking at is this as you say, incoherence at the very least in the US strategy. So obviously a lot to keep in mind and on our radar with regards to the Middle East. And definitely we will be looking more and more at, we've got to keep our eye on some of the theaters outside of Iran. So good that you bring that up, Andrew, and we'll be certain to update everyone in the weeks to come. And just pivoting now quickly, as you mentioned, Andrew, to the Indo-Pacific. Let's have a look at some of the stuff happening there. So actually the news today, we're recording this August 20th, Thursday morning. We got the news that North Korea launched more than 10 ballistic missiles into the sea east of the peninsula. Now, it landed in international waters, and a lot of people are saying that this is more of a warning shot. And North Korea is known to do this. They routinely will test their missile capabilities, shooting 1 or even 2 missiles at a time. This, I have to say, is quite a large number for a single test firing. And experts have pointed out that this is likely a warning to the United States and to South Korea against drilling their militaries together. And this has been actually quite a big news story over the course of the week. We got the news at the start of the week that President Trump was calling for a reduction of involvement by US forces in the joint drills, as you mentioned up top, Jared, with South Korea. Which is obviously quite a notable story, specifically because these calls were heeded and resulted in quite a large reduction of the drills. Jared, you've been keeping an eye on this news story as well. How do you make sense of this?
So on the surface, it would almost seem that this type of move would be incongruous. North Korea effectively got a lot of what it wanted. There was a sharp reduction in both the U.S. troop numbers as well as the extension of the reduction in the days of the military drills. So it would seem almost odd that they're choosing to have this more escalatory stance. But in my opinion, from what I've been seeing, the type of patterns that North Korea attempts to establish is it needs to be aware, it needs to be sure that what it is doing is something that it can fundamentally get away with. And by launching this large series of missiles very shortly after kind of getting what it wanted from the U.S., it is kind of a proof of concept of saying, we can do this now that you're gone, and now that you're not as present, now that it seems like you're willing to draw back more, we can become a little bit more provocative. And if there's not going to be a strong American response to this, if there's not going to be a strong Pan-Asian response to this, then it is something that is kind of going to tell North Korea, we can continue to do this. This is something that many authoritarian regimes have done throughout history, kind of testing the waters early on to see, like, hey, is there going to be a sharp response to this escalatory action? If not, it might be the kind of building block toward the next step.
Yeah, Jared, let me ask you the same question that Milos asked me a minute ago about the Middle East. What is the Trump administration trying to accomplish right now with North Korea?
So I think the Trump administration's actions with North Korea are largely one of a short-term kind of strategic convenience. Right now, if the Trump administration wants to continue operations at the pace it has been within the Middle East, it needs to withdraw more troops from Asia. And kind of having this sort of dialogue of, well, North Korea can be reasonable, we can talk with them, Kim Jong-un wants a better bilateral peace, that type of thing. It helps feed into the narrative that we don't need as strong a presence in Asia. North Korea can be reasoned with, and therefore we are more justified in moving troops and material away towards Iran. Now, as far as like a kind of a long-term aspect, I'm not really convinced that there is a cohesive long-term plan set in place for how to deal with both North Korea and China going forward. I think right now the Trump administration is a lot more concerned with short-term kind of strategic goals within Iran and goals that will present well in the media in kind of getting close to the midterm elections here. And the type of troop withdrawal from Asia is not presenting a really big electoral problem. That is not the type of thing in American media that is gets reported a lot that actually shifts votes one way or another. So I think that as a result of this type of necessity of for their strategic goals in the Middle East, I think that that's kind of, it's more of a short-term gain, but it is having major effects. It's convincing a lot of American allies that they might not be as that America might not be as reliable, and even if in the face of Chinese aggression, and even if America is willing to defend them, if the material resources, if the military power is simply not there, then they're going to be forced to reckon with the idea that no matter what, they're going to have to develop a much more powerful military apparatus as well as much more cohesive military planning among the Asian states, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. They're going to need to become more integrated with each other as they are no longer able to necessarily rely on America solely.
Yeah, and I think to also give my 2 cents on your question there, Andrew, I think the Trump administration has shown, as Jared has said, that it is quite keen on getting that good headline going, especially with regards to geopolitical events, geopolitical crises and conflicts. And North Korea has quite for a long time been a thorn in America's side in the region, and routinely been a problem that has not, it's not always been clear how to resolve it, especially because of North Korea's alliance with China and now ostensibly ever more so with Russia. And I think that certainly President Trump, I believe, would very much like that title as being the president who brought Kim Jong-un, this mythological almost problem for the United States, to a negotiating table. I think that it is, the demands made by North Korea, if this were to happen, would be, if the US conceded all of them, that would be quite a major loss of US influence in the region, which would obviously please China as well. But this is, this could obviously pose some problems in the long run. I find it interesting that this same week we've seen engagement not only by the US but by China with South Korea. The day after that, this announcement was made of Trump calling for reduction in drill numbers. So I would not be surprised at all. We know that there is a summit coming up between President Trump and President Xi of China in September, that this would feature on the agenda in some capacity. China being quite close and growing closer with North Korea over the past few months, I think that it would be well positioned to, potentially mediate something if this is what Trump would want, and this is something he stated before that he would want. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. Jared.
Yeah, to touch on something that you just brought up, you brought up a really good point that China is now starting to send its own representatives to places like South Korea. South Korea is a very interesting place for China because, especially as the U.S. becomes less involved in the Korean Peninsula, Korea in particular has begun to feel a little bit more abandoned because, unlike Japan or the Philippines, they're under a lot more immediate threat, what with North Korea and China being so close to it. And as a result, China may end up actually having some reasonable amount of success in certainly not turning South Korea into a Chinese ally, but kind of pulling it away from that more joint security relationship, because China's main goal, as America is starting to pull out a little bit, is to prevent the establishment of a pan-Asian anti-Chinese alliance. And if they can kind of sweet talk South Korea away from it, that would seriously compromise that alliance's ability to counter anything that China does. And another really important aspect to understand about, like what you were just mentioning about headlines, is the type of troop withdrawal does not threaten the Trump positions as much as it would with like the tension that was caused with NATO, because unlike with the more European states that actually have a lot more like security assurances and they have a lot more unity with themselves, and frankly, Russia is not as big a threat to like France existentially as it is, as since they can't even get halfway through Ukraine. But for the Asian states, they're a lot more. They have not seen a lot of rhetorical backlash against the United States for this move, as we saw with Europe, because they simply just don't have the capacity to. They need American security guarantees, so there has not been as much of a backlash from the actual administrations of these Asian states. You have not heard a lot of discontent from them because they're a lot more dependent on the U.S. than like the NATO allies were, and that has produced the effect that it has not brought down a lot of condemnation on the Trump administration from a lot of the American people. So it's a very delicate little political move that's being gone here. And
it should be said that there's a lot of assumptions made both in the defense doctrines of Indo-Pacific countries, but also in the US's Indo-Pacific strategy. Certainly a few years ago, it was entirely contingent on the assumption that the US would be granted access to bases in Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, which it obviously has access to in peacetime, but in wartime, that remains, to be seen, especially now, as you mentioned, with that influence being shaken.
Yeah, I think one of the important things to kind of end on is like the perception of the Asian nations here, because like in Europe, for instance, like without the United States, the European Union combined, the other NATO states combined, dwarf Russia's military potential. If they had to stand up alone against Russia, given how they've done in Ukraine, they could do it. All of the Pan-Asian states combined are dwarfed by China. They even all together, without the United States, they could not stand up. To a joint Chinese attack. None of them have nuclear weapons. Their populations and military are dwarfed by China, just by China alone. So it's just important to maintain the understanding that this is not the same strategic situation going on in Europe, and it has to be discussed differently.
Absolutely. Well, lots to cover still, but I think we'll have to wrap it there for today. Bit of a longer episode than usual, but I think it is important to get into the nuts and bolts of some of these developments coming out of all these regions. In the meantime, to our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all the topics that we've covered today, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter, as well as access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jared. Thank you all for listening.